back to the Seaboard Central, everyone. In today's video, we're going to discuss tonnage ratings and how I can simulate that with my models. So if this sounds interesting to you, keep watching. And if you enjoy the video, I do appreciate a like. And also be sure to leave a comment before you leave. So without further ado, let's get started. In an earlier video, I discussed locomotive tractive effort and how they vary depending on each locomotive type or model. When it comes down to a locomotive's tonnage rating, locomotives with similar tractive effort are assigned into groups. Besides the locomotive's tractive effort, the tonnage rating is also determined by the steepest grade over a particular line segment, or in many cases, a district of the railroad between two crew change points. Tonnage ratings can vary widely depending on the locomotive type and the grade over the line. Let me explain. Tonnage ratings are listed in employee timetables. You can often find older timetables listed for sale on eBay or at train shows. They're a great source of information, especially if you can find one that pertains to the area and time frame you model. Here's an example of the tonnage ratings for my particular district that I operate on, between Atlanta, Georgia and Greenville, South Carolina. And you can see these ratings vary dependent on the group. You see they go from group 1 to group 6. So how do we know what locomotives are in group 1, for example, and group 6? I'll show you. So in this particular timetable, we find the diesel unit groups listed in the beginning of the timetable. And you can see how they've put each model in each different group. Now this is Norfolk Southern, so your railroad may vary. But for example, your typical SD40-2 for NS is assigned to group number 3. Now, what I find interesting is looking back at older timetables. For example, this Southern Railway timetable, Georgia Division timetable from 1982. I find looking at these older timetables interesting because back then they only had 4 groups, and you can see how they categorized each group. And I find this interesting because they put the SD9s and the GP9s in the same group, where you'd think that they would be in separate groups. Also, the SD40 and SD45s made up the largest locomotives on the roster at that time. Tonnage ratings can also vary depending on which direction the train is traveling. For example, this is north and south. It could be east and west depending on your timetable. Well, let's look at this example between Bremen, Georgia and Cedartown, Georgia for an SD40. Going north, they're rated for 3,050 tons each. But going south between Bremen and Cedartown, they're only rated for 2,350 tons. Let's look at a real-world example of NS Train 154, which still operates today between Birmingham, Alabama and Linwood, North Carolina. Now, the tonnage rating for the train is always determined by the most restrictive line segment on the route between Birmingham and Linwood. So what I find interesting is back in 1979, they actually had 5 groups, which included the old SW1200s for yard switchers. We'll note here between Norris Yard in Birmingham to Inman Yard in Atlanta, they separated it out into 3 line segments traveling south or east, with the line segment between Anniston, Alabama and Bremen, Georgia being the steepest one. For an SD40 was 1,850 tons. Pretty steep grade. Now on the Piedmont side, between Inman Yard and Spencer Yard, we don't see any line segment that is steeper than that 1,850 tons for an SD40. So that particular line segment on the Birmingham side was the ruling grade. So for my Seaboard Central, the ruling grade for trains traveling east or south is the Helix. And this has a grade that varies between 1.8% and 2%. So looking at the Seaboard Central master plan of what I hope the layout eventually looks like, we see that we have a Nolix here where we have a continuous grade climbing up out of staging, 2.5% grade until it reaches the summit. So on the Seaboard Central, I've separated my locomotive roster into 4 different groups, with Group 1 having examples like the SW1500, MP15DC, and the GP15-1, and Group 4 are having the SD38, SD39R, SD40-2 and SD40T-2. You'll notice that in Group 3 there's only one locomotive model, that B40-8. Now for the tonnage rating for my locomotives, I'll list out Group 1 is 5 cars, Group 2 is 6 cars, Group 3 is 7 cars, and Group 4 is 8 cars. So that's per unit. So if you have a consist with 3 units, you have to look and see what group that locomotive is in, and that'll determine how many cars the tonnage rating will handle for that particular train. So if we look in our locomotive ready tracks here at Gadsden, we'll see 2 sets of locomotives. They actually have the same tonnage rating, even though they're different models. And you'll see ready track number 1 has the SD39R, a GP38-2, and an SD38, where ready track 2 has 2 SD40s bracketed and a GP30U. So if we look back at our groups, the 2 SD40s would equal 16 cars, plus the GP30U would be another 6, for a total of 22 cars they're capable of pulling over the line. Where the other locomotives, you have a SD38 and an SD39R, same situation, 16 cars, and you have a GP38-2 for 6 cars. Same thing, 22 cars maximum. So a good example is my transfer job, T85, otherwise known as Tango 85, if you check that video out. That was a really cool video. I'm surprised it didn't have more views. But anyway, it typically has between 18 and 20 cars on it. So either one of those consists are capable of handling that train. So in addition to Seaboard Central trains, there are a pair of Norfolk Southern run-through trains and a transfer job that operates on the SC. And since NS runs a lot larger locomotives, I do have them in different groups. For example, this SD70 and ES44DC locomotive would be in a Group 5, and they will be capable of handling 9 cars each. So just these 2 locomotives themselves could handle 18 cars. Now these 2 ES44AC units in the foreground make up the largest group, group number 6, and I rate them at 10 cars each. So these 2 locomotives could pull 20 cars by themselves. So I hope you've enjoyed this video on how I try to simulate prototype-based operating practices on the Seaboard Central, even if they are somewhat condensed compared to the prototype. So until next time, I'm Tim Garland. Thanks for watching the Seaboard Central, and happy model railroading, everyone.